are going in 5 seconds. 3,
Well, the second of our two most important founding documents as Americans is the Constitution. Does anybody here know what day of the year we celebrate as Constitution Day? There's a real test. Anybody? September 17th. 1787 was the day that the Constitution was signed, and then it went off for ratification. But September the 17th, the Constitutional Convention concluded its work and turned it over to we the people. So this presentation on the Constitution is called Organizing the Powers. The United States Constitution is the supreme law of the land. It says so in Article 6. This Constitution shall be the supreme law of the land. It is not God's perfect law. However, it is man's best law. It organizes and limits the powers of the federal government so that it has only enough powers to secure we the people's safety and happiness. The words of the Declaration again said, to institute new government, laying its foundation on such principles, and again, that was the Declaration. We've already talked about that. And organizing its powers in such form as to them shall seem most likely to effect their safety and happiness. That is the Constitution. So that's what we're going to look at now. The Constitution takes 4 pages of parchment, the original. Now I know you can't read that, but this is there just to illustrate. It's not really that long. It's far shorter than the Obamacare law, I'll tell you that. It's divided into 7 articles, just for it's the way it's organized. It's kind of a way to outline things. Article 1 deals with the legislative branch. And in the Constitution, first things are always first. Most important things always occur first. So the most important branch of government and the most powerful branch, according to the intent of the founders, was the Congress, or the legislative branch. Article 2 deals with the executive branch. We call him the President of the United States. Article 3 deals with the judicial branch, the Supreme Court, and the lower federal courts. Article 4 deals with states, relationships between the states and between the states and the federal government, a little bit there. Article 5 describes 2 processes by which amendments may take place. Article 6 contains the supremacy clause that we looked at a moment ago, and also the oath of office that all federal officers must take. And finally, Article 7 deals with ratification, how the Constitution was to be ratified. James Madison said, every word of it decides a question between power and liberty. And speaking of the United States Constitution, every word of it decides a question between power and liberty. We need to step back just for a moment and take a look at why we need government. Why government? Well, it really comes down to this. Man is sinful, self-interested, and corruptible. Have you noticed? Jeremiah 17:9 and also Ecclesiastes 7:20 says essentially the same thing. The heart is deceitful above all things and desperately wicked. In the New Testament, Romans 3:23, also in 1 John 1:10, for all have sinned and fall short of the glory of God. James Madison, the father of the Constitution, said, if men were angels, no government would be necessary. Well, that isn't quite theologically correct, because we know, the Bible tells us, that fully 1/3 of the angels fell. And even angels need order. So civil government is necessary. It's to be an enforcer of God's natural law, and it is one of 3 human institutions that is ordained by God, civil government. Can anybody tell me what one of the other 2 human institutions ordained by God is? There are 2 more. Name one.
The church.
The church. One more. The basic building block of society.
family.
The family. Those are the 3 institutions, human institutions, ordained by God. The church, the family, and civil government. The purpose of government, we remember this from the presentation on the Declaration, to protect our natural rights, which are God-given. It does this by a couple of different ways. First, it must restrain the exercise of sin. The famous verses in Romans 13, "Rulers are not a cause of fear for good behavior, but for evil. For civil government is a minister of God to you for good. But if you do what is evil, be afraid, for it does not bear the sword for nothing. For it is a minister of God, an avenger who brings wrath on the one who practices evil." This is what civil government is supposed to do. It also maintains order. Benjamin Franklin wrote in the Pennsylvania Gazette, November 20th, 1735, "All true happiness, as all that is truly beautiful, can only result from order." That sounds like Benjamin Franklin. 1 Timothy 2:2 tells us that we may lead a tranquil and quiet life in all godliness and dignity. So civil government must maintain order for those things to happen, and it must restrain the exercise of sin. But there's a nasty fact of government, and Lord Acton nailed it when he said, "Power tends to corrupt, and absolute power corrupts absolutely." I'm sure you've all heard that. So that leads then to the great dilemma of government. And James Madison said, in framing a government which is to be administered by men over men, the great difficulty lies in this: you must first enable the government to control the governed, and in the next place, oblige it to control itself. That's from the Federalist, number 51. So what then are the keys to good government? There are two. The first is character, and the second is limits. They're both important. We're going to take a look at each of them individually. First, character. Proverbs 29:2 says, "When the righteous are in authority, the people rejoice. But when the wicked beareth rule, the people sigh." Freedom is impossible without virtue. Virtue on the part of leaders or rulers, and virtue on the part of the people. That's particularly true in a system of government such as ours, where the rulers come from among the people. John Adams said, "Our Constitution was made only for immoral and religious people. It is wholly inadequate for the government of any other. Only a people which are capable of self-government can be ruled or governed by a constitution providing the kinds of liberties that ours provides." George Washington said, "Of all the dispositions and habits which lead to political prosperity, religion and morality are indispensable supports." Those come from his farewell address. Benjamin Franklin said, "Only a virtuous people are capable of freedom. As nations become corrupt and vicious, they have need of masters. And if we have masters, what does that make us? Slaves, precisely." So what is freedom? If you ask a number of people, what is freedom, you'll probably get some interesting answers. But a typical answer, and usually, particularly from young people, it's the power to decide right and wrong, to decide for myself what is right and wrong, to do what I want to do. That is a common perception of freedom. I submit that freedom is not so much the right to choose. Freedom is the result of making right choices. There's a big difference. Freedom is the result of making right choices. And then limits. Thomas Jefferson said, "In questions of power, then, let no more be heard of confidence in man, but bind him down from mischief by the chains of the Constitution." Limits. In the Institute on the Constitution, Dr. John Eidsmoe presents his founding fathers' five-fold formula. He really likes alliteration. First, limited delegated powers. It's all about limits. Next, a vertical division of powers. Next, horizontal separation of powers. Next, a system of checks and balances. And next, reserved individual rights. And those serve as the basis for what we're going to look at tonight. The primary theme is the doctrines of the Constitution. These seven. First, fidelity to declaration principles. Next, the doctrine of original intent. Next, the doctrine of enumerated powers. Next, the doctrine of separation of powers. Next, the doctrine of balance of powers. Next, the doctrine of representation. And finally, the doctrine of reserved individual rights. We're going to take a look at these one at a time. First, fidelity to Declaration principles, or first principles, as they were known. And we talked about these in the Declaration. Briefly, they are natural law, truth, the God of the Bible, who is our Creator, the idea of God-given unalienable rights, the concept of equality, what the purpose of government is, that government is a social compact governing with the consent of the governed, the idea of nationhood, that sovereignty, the sovereignty of individuals and the sovereignty of nations. These are all great first principles from the Declaration of Independence. And the first doctrine of the Constitution is fidelity to those principles. In the case of Gulf Colorado Santa Fe Railway versus Ellis in 1891, the United States Supreme Court noted, "The Constitution is but the letter of which the Declaration of Independence is the thought and the spirit, and it is always safe to read the letter of the Constitution in the spirit of the Declaration." Some people will say, well, you know, the Declaration's a nice document, and it expresses all of those noble ideals, and it's really nice. I like to read it, and they're great concepts. But it isn't law. It doesn't carry the force of law. Oh, yes, it does. A number of times, the United States Congress has placed the Declaration of Independence in the United States Code, most recently, January 3rd, 2007. It's at the beginning of the U.S. Code under the heading, The Organic Laws of the United States of America. So the Declaration of Independence most certainly is United States law. That's the fidelity to Declaration principles. Now we're going to look at original intent. How do we know original intent? We hear a lot about it, but how do we really know what it is? Well, you have to read the founders' primary source documents. Read the Constitution. Read the Declaration of Independence. It's not hard. Read the Federalist Papers. Those are a little harder. That's a challenge, but read them. Read their speeches. They were prolific writers, and people wrote down their speeches. Listen to what they had to say for themselves, for the documents that they left us, not what some revisionist historian tells you that they intended. Read the original intent. Read the prime source documents. Read their private letters. They were prolific writers. We looked at the letters of John and Abigail Adams a little earlier. That's one example. Jefferson said, on every question of construction, carry ourselves back to the time when the Constitution was adopted. Recollect the spirit manifested in the debates, and instead of trying what meaning may be squeezed out of the text or invented against it, conform to the probable one in which it was passed. Read it and apply common sense. The idea of a living Constitution is a relatively new idea. It's that the meaning changes and evolves with time. The living Constitution idea was invented in the early 20th century by self-proclaimed progressives who did not want to be limited in their utopian plans. They did not want to be bound down from mischief by the chains of the Constitution, and so they started preaching the idea of a living Constitution, which can mean anything they want it to mean. George Washington, on the other hand, said, if in the opinion of the people, the distribution of the constitutional powers be at any particular wrong, let it be corrected by an amendment in the way the Constitution designates. But let there be no change by usurpation. It is the customary weapon by which free governments are destroyed. Usurpation. We see it all around us. That's the doctrine of original intent. Next, the doctrine of enumerated powers. Very, very, very important doctrine, and one which is really not taught in law school, even in con law, constitutional law. Why? Because it's just too embarrassing. The federal government has been operating for so many years with complete disregard for the doctrine of enumerated powers, it is just too embarrassing to talk about it. George Washington said, government is force. Like fire, it is a dangerous servant and a fearful master. A quick review. The purpose of government is to secure rights by restraining the exercise of sin, but the problem is those who govern have the same sin nature as those they govern. So, the framers' solution, twofold. First, limit federal powers to matters that only the new federal government must of necessity govern. It was a new federal government in 1787. So limit the powers to matters that only that government must of necessity govern. Thomas Jefferson said, "Most bad government has grown out of too much government." Indeed. An example of this comes right at the beginning of the body of the Constitution itself. The very first words at the opening of Article 1, Section 1 read as follows: "All legislative powers herein granted shall be vested in a Congress." Now, Congress today largely operates as if the Constitution said, all legislative powers shall be vested in a Congress. They don't like those two little words, but they're there. It says, all legislative powers herein granted shall be vested in a Congress. Remember what Madison said? Every word of it decides a question between power and liberty, and there's no better example of it than right here. All legislative powers herein granted. And in Article 1, Section 8, it lists the 18 powers that Congress can pass laws on. 18 matters that Congress has the authority to legislate over. They're matters primarily of war and peace and coining a common currency throughout the United States and establishing weights and measures and the things that need to be done by a central government, must be done by a central government, the carrying on of foreign policy, etc. Those powers are given to Congress in Article 1, Section 8, and there are about 18 of them. So limit federal powers to matters that only the new federal government must of necessity govern, and list or enumerate those limited powers in writing. James Madison said, the powers of the federal government are, what? Enumerated. It can only operate in certain cases. It has legislative powers on defined and limited objects, beyond which it cannot extend its jurisdiction. This is the father of the Constitution speaking. So, an example of this, Article 1, Section 8. At the close of that section, it listed the 18 powers that Congress can legislate on, and then it has these words. The Congress shall have power to make laws which shall be necessary and proper for carrying into execution the foregoing powers. Once again, Congress has their eraser, and they want it to read, to make all laws which we think shall be necessary and proper. It doesn't say that. It says, to make all laws which shall be necessary and proper for carrying into execution the foregoing powers. What powers? The foregoing powers. What were they? The 18 that were listed in Article 1, Section 8. Necessary and proper for carrying into execution those powers. Not anything they want to do, but for carrying into execution those powers. God's written word placed limits upon Israel's government structure. We're talking about limits. It's a biblical concept. The structure at the time was kings. And in Deuteronomy 17, verses 14 through 20, we find these examples. One thing it says is, set a king over you, whom the Lord your God chooses, one from among your countrymen. You may not put a foreigner over you. Where do you think we get the Article 2 requirement that the President of the United States must be a natural-born citizen? Now, the topic of the meaning of natural-born citizen, very fascinating, but it's a subject for another time. Don't have time to get into that much tonight. But you may not put a foreigner over you. Our founders got that concept right out of the Old Testament in Deuteronomy. You may not put a foreigner over you. He shall not multiply horses for himself. Well, that's a strange one. Did they have horse racing and they didn't want it? What was the deal? What's this multiply horses for himself? Well, two things you need to understand. First of all, the horse in Old Testament times was the ultimate weapon of war. Horses, chariots, based upon the horse. The horse was the ultimate weapon of war. And the key word here is for himself. He shall not have his own private army to send hither and yon, doing his personal will. We get this concept of Congress having the power to declare war, then the president becomes commander-in-chief and executes the war. We get the same thing. It's not his army to do with as he pleases. It is the people's army, represented by their representatives in Congress. They are the ones that make that fateful decision to commit troops and resources to war, not the president. He then becomes commander-in-chief after the Congress declares the war. This comes right out of the Old Testament. Not multiply horses for himself, to have his own private army to do as he pleases. His heart may not be lifted up above his countrymen. Well, this is really pretty simple. We have a lot of laws being passed today that exempt Congress and the President from the same legislation they're passing on the rest of us, okay? Well, this is this idea of his heart being lifted up above his countrymen. We have a requirement in the Constitution, which we'll take a quick look at in a minute, no titles of nobility. This is what this is all about. They are people, citizens, just like the rest of us, subject to the same laws that we are. These concepts come from Bill Iles and Anderson's book, Contending for the Constitution. Just as this presentation was to be a kind of a sister piece to laying the foundation on the Declaration, this book was to be kind of a sister book to Defending the Declaration by Gary Amos. This is Contending for the Constitution. Again, if you want to dig more deeply into this stuff, a highly recommended resource. There's one that is not mentioned in their book. Ezra 7:24 says, "You have no authority to impose taxes on any of the priests or other workers at this house of God." This is where we get the idea of the tax-exempt status for churches, right out of the Old Testament. So, enumerated powers. Article 1, Section 8 grants some 18 powers to the Congress. Article 2, Sections 2 and 3 grant some 13 powers to the President, the executive branch. And Article 3, Section 2 grants some 5 powers to the Supreme Court. Notice the reduced number of powers as we go down here. Most of the power is vested in Congress, the representatives of the people and the states. Madison in Federalist 45 writes, "The powers delegated by the proposed Constitution to the federal government are few and defined. Those which are to remain in the state governments are numerous and indefinite." Notice the contrast. The former will be exercised principally on external objects as war, peace, negotiation, and foreign commerce. The powers reserved to the several states will extend to all of the objects, which in the ordinary course of affairs concern the lives, liberties, and properties of the people, and the internal order, improvement, and prosperity of the states. I'm thinking of things like education, health care, labor, finance, those kinds of things. Thomas Jefferson said, "I consider the foundation of the Constitution as laid on this ground, the 10th Amendment. This is a restatement of the doctrine of enumerated powers. It says, the powers not delegated to the United States by the Constitution, nor prohibited by it to the states, are reserved to the states respectively, or to the people. That is the doctrine of enumerated powers." It's still there. It's in the 10th Amendment, and that is most certainly part of the Constitution, the keystone of the Bill of Rights. In questions of power, then, let no more be heard of confidence in man, but bind him down from mischief by the chains of the Constitution. Jefferson again. So that's the doctrine of enumerated powers, so vitally important. Next is the doctrine of separation of powers. Madison said, "When all government shall be drawn to Washington as the center of all power, it will render powerless the checks provided of one government on another, and will become as oppressive as the government from which we separated." Now, this idea of checks provided of one government on another, he's talking about state governments checking the federal government. That's what he's talking about. We'll see that's what it means here in a minute. There are a couple of dimensions to this separation of powers. The first is a vertical dimension, federalism, a vertical separation of powers, the idea of different levels of government, each divided into their own areas of sovereign authority with a flow of powers, and we'll see how that works in this diagram. Levels of government. All of these are levels of government. First, God. God is sovereign over all. He is the governor, the creator of the universe. God passes some sovereignty and some power to us as individuals. Our dealings are with God directly in that regard. Our rights come directly from God, not through government. They come to us directly from God. So some power and sovereignty flows down from God to us as individuals by His grace. Individuals voluntarily combine together in families and churches. Those are the two other human institutions ordained by God. And when you as an individual marry, become part of a family, or join a church, you give up some of your absolute sovereignty for the benefit of your family or your small organization, your church, or whatever. Some of the power flows from you, and some of your sovereignty flows from yourself to these small groups, families and churches. And smaller groups like that tend to gather together in municipalities or cities, and some power and sovereignty to pass zoning ordinances and such things pass to municipalities. And then some power and authority and sovereignty then flows to the county level, kind of the next level, and then to the states. And then finally the states got together and created this thing called the federal government. And a very limited amount of sovereignty and power over certain delegated, enumerated objects passed from the people and the states down to that last level of government at the federal level. It's kind of an inverted triangle, or an inverted pyramid if you kind of like to think in 3 dimensions. This is the concept of one nation under God in diagrammatic form, illustrating the vertical separation of powers, or federalism. That's starting to look familiar. Bingo. There's our flag again. So once again, the next time you look at a flag and you see those 7 red stripes, think of the 7 levels of government. At the top we have God, next is individuals, and then families and churches, municipalities, counties, states, and finally the federal government at the bottom. Now we all know that the progressives see things a little differently. This is the plan of the founders, and they've kind of got things inverted. This is the way they see it. They see the federal government at the top, with powers over everything. And the states are merely subdivisions to carry out the will of the federal government. And the counties, the same with the states, the municipalities, families and churches get governed by all those levels of government above them, and they're made up of individuals, and, well, we'll throw God in at the bottom because it makes people feel good. So if there's room, we fit him into the bottom. And that's the inverted progressive view of this vertical separation of powers. Now there's a sub-doctrine tied in with this idea of different levels of government, different governments, and one is interposition. We already talked a little bit about this in the other presentation, but the doctrine of interposition. This is the way it works. Here's the plan, here's the vertical separation of powers. If the federal government throws off its bounds, gets puffed up, and starts moving on families and churches, and we see this happening all the time, in everything from health care to abusive tax policies to telling your kids what they can and can't, whatever, you name it. Families and churches. Well, this is going to weaken and eventually destroy families and churches. Not a good thing. So, Madison said in 1799 in the Virginia resolved that the General Assembly of Virginia doth explicitly and peremptorily declare that it views the powers of the federal government as limited by the plain sense and intention of the instrument constituting the compact, the Constitution, as no further valid than they are authorized by the grants enumerated in that compact, and that in case of exercise of other powers not granted by the said compact, the states who are parties thereto have the right and are in duty bound to interpose for arresting the progress of the evil and for maintaining within their respective limits the authorities, rights, and liberties appertaining to them. That's where we get this doctrine of interposition. It looks something like this. The federal government throws off its bounds, gets puffed up, and goes after families and churches. But the states step in and say, this is not in your realm of authority. You are legislating in matters that are to be left to the states and the people. We are interposing, not in our state. We see some examples of this taking place with some of the provisions of Obamacare. Some of the states have actually stepped up and said, not in our state, we're not enforcing this part of Obamacare. They're not calling it nullification or interposition or whatever, but that's what they're doing. And that's a very encouraging thing to see on my behalf, because that's what the founders intended. That's exactly what. If the states don't do their job, we have yet another level of government standing in the way. The counties can step up, particularly the county sheriff. Thank heaven for Richard Mack and other constitutional sheriffs, and thank God for the Oath Keepers. But the idea the sheriff is the highest law enforcement official elected and therefore directly accountable to the people. So counties can step in. We saw that happening a little bit with the Bundys, not as much as it should have, but at least the concept is there. Counties can stand as the next level of defense, that level of government. If counties don't do their job, then municipalities, as a last resort, can step in and say, not in my city. This is unconstitutional. It's clearly unconstitutional. We're not going to impose that on our people. And that puts the federal government back in its proper place, and that's interposition in action. There's another sub-doctrine that ties in, and that's the doctrine of nullification. And we get this from Thomas Jefferson, among others, in the Kentucky Resolutions. Same year, 10 years, a decade after the Constitution was ratified. The several states who formed the Constitution, being sovereign and independent, have the unquestionable right to judge of its infraction. And a nullification by those sovereignties of all unauthorized acts done under color of that instrument is the rightful remedy. Thomas Jefferson. Some powers are forbidden to the states by the Constitution. Here are some examples. They're in Article 1, Section 10. States can't do some things. No state shall enter into any treaty, that's for the national government to do, alliance or confederation. No state may coin money, pass any bill of attainder, ex post facto law, or law impairing the obligation of contracts, or grant any title of nobility. We talked about that earlier. Other things states may not do. No state shall, without the consent of Congress, enter into any agreement or compact with another state, or with a foreign power, or engage in war unless actually invaded, or in such imminent danger as will not admit of delay. Now, many current events in our country tie directly to this, and it's being violated and ignored. Okay? One example. A group have gotten together, and they're going to meet again on, I guess, Friday, the 4th of July, in Dallas. They call themselves the Compact of States. And their purpose is to gather and form a constitutional convention, which they do not call a constitutional convention. They call it Compact of the States. State governors or representatives of state governors from, they hope, 38 states or more, will gather in Dallas for the purpose, supposedly, of passing a balanced budget amendment of some kind. And here's the interesting part. By virtue of the fact that 38 states, or maybe more, will be represented at that conference, that Compact of States gathering, whatever they come up with, supposedly they know it's going to be a balanced budget amendment. That's another issue. Could be that, could be something else, who knows. But whatever they come up with will be deemed to be pre-ratified by virtue of the fact that 13 states agreed to send representatives to the conference in the first place. 38. That's 3/4 of the states. That's the number of states that's required to ratify an amendment to the Constitution. But notice the end run around the Constitution that's taking place here. The Constitution provides, in Method B, for a constitutional convention, which, if it takes place, whatever the product of that is, must go off to the states to be ratified by 3/4 of the states before it becomes an amendment. They're doing an end run about that. They're saying, by virtue of the fact that 38 states have agreed to come and pass this particular amendment, they have agreed to pre-ratify. It's blatantly unconstitutional. And what does this say right here in Article 1, Section 10? No state shall, without the consent of Congress, enter into any agreement or compact with another state. That's in the name. They call themselves a Compact of States. That's exactly what they're doing. And let me assure you, Congress did not authorize this. I checked with Rohrabacher's office. No way. So they're blatantly ignoring the Constitution. The state of Arizona was having a problem with illegal aliens. They tried to do something about it. That something was basically just enforce existing federal law. Well, the Justice Department got involved and says, no, you can't do that. That's our job. Arizona said, yeah, I know it's your job, but you're not doing it, so we're going to do it. Okay? We're being invaded here. What does the Constitution allow? Well, Arizona can't engage in war unless actually invaded or in such imminent danger as will not admit of delay. A lot of the border states say we're in that position right now. So if they could constitutionally go to war, certainly they have the ability to pass laws peacefully. In fact, they're the same laws that are already on the federal books that are not being enforced. Certainly they have the ability to protect themselves by passing laws, if they could in fact go to war. Anyway, interesting thoughts here. Constitution is so relevant to so many things that are going on. Madison in the Federalist 47 wrote, the accumulation of all powers, legislative, executive, and judiciary, in the same hands may justly be pronounced the very definition of tyranny. So we have a horizontal dimension of separation of powers where we have three branches of government, each vested with different powers. Of course, the legislative with their 18 powers, the executive with their 13 powers, and the judicial with their 5 powers. 3 branches on a horizontal plane. By the way, vested, very important legal word. Vested means permanently and irrevocably fixed. What does that mean? It means that powers vested in one branch may absolutely not be exercised by another. We see violations of this all the time. We have a president with a phone and a pen, and he's effectively, he thinks he is, passing laws. That is vested in Congress, ladies and gentlemen. The president has no constitutional power to govern by executive order. Executive orders are for the internal governance of the executive branch and so forth, not to pass laws that affect we the people. We send representatives to Congress to do that, and they are vested with that power. They must not relinquish that power, and the president may not usurp it. That's what vested means. So that's the doctrine of separation of powers, vertical and horizontal. Next is the doctrine of balance of powers. Madison in the Federalist 51 said, "Give to those who administer each department the necessary constitutional means and personal motives to resist encroachment of the others. Ambition must be made to counteract ambition." And there we see the 3 branches jostling for power. That's the plan of the founders. That's what's supposed to be. The 3 branches of the federal government were supposed to be jostling for power. Instead, they've kind of colluded together and are usurping powers from us, the people and the states, because they've figured that it's easier to cooperate than jostle and contend with each other. At any rate, this is checks and balances in diagrammatical form. We've got the 3 branches of government, legislative at the top, executive in the lower left, and judicial in the lower right. And these checks and balances that are built into the Constitution. Let's take a look first at the checks and balances provided between Congress and the President. Congress, of course, consists of 2 houses, and the House of Representatives is to represent the people. The Senate is to represent the states. That was the design of the founders. Then we got the 17th Amendment. That upset the whole thing. We'll talk about it later. But the Senate was supposed to represent states. The House is to represent the people. And all bills passed must meet the approval of the states and the people. The President, though, can veto a bill. That's a check that the President has on the Congress. The Congress can check right back because they can override his veto. Furthermore, the Congress declares war, and the Commander-in-Chief's only role is to conduct that war. So there's a little shared power, a little checking and balancing going on there. Congress can govern the military. The Constitution gives Congress the power to make rules that govern the military. Congress provides advice and consent to presidential appointments. Congress confirms presidential appointments, and Congress finally holds the card of impeachment against the President. Now let's look at the balance of powers. Well, first of all, notice that most of the power, most of the checks on behalf of the Congress against the President. That's the system the founders gave us. And the balance between Congress and the courts goes something like this. Henceforth, cases brought up from the states on appeal involving this issue, fill in the blank, are off limits for the appellate jurisdiction of the federal courts. They can do that. It can be done as part of a piece of legislation that Congress passes, or it can be done after the fact. Congress has the power to limit the appellate jurisdiction of the Supreme Court. Congress can confirm appointments to the courts or not. Congress can disestablish the courts. The only court required by the Constitution is the United States Supreme Court. All the other federal courts have been created by Congress, and therefore Congress could disestablish those lower courts at the federal level if they wanted to. Congress can impeach federal judges. That has been done. You can look it up on the internet. It's happened several times. The courts have one check on the Congress, which John Marshall invented. It's not actually in the Constitution. That's why I put it in parentheses. It's that idea of judicial review, that if Congress in fact passes a law that's unconstitutional, one remedy to that is the courts can strike it down. And early in our history, they were striking down many things which were in fact unconstitutional, things like the income tax. So it was a good thing for a while, but it's been abused in recent times, and we all know that. Congress may pass something that's perfectly constitutional, but the courts don't like it, so they declare it unconstitutional. Or Congress does pass something by hook or by crook, something like Obamacare, it's blatantly unconstitutional. The courts have a duty to overturn it, but they're not. It's another story. Now, the balance between the President and the courts goes something like this. The President appoints judges, the President can issue pardons. And the courts preside over the impeachment. If the President is impeached, then the Chief Justice of the Supreme Court presides over the Senate when the trial is held on the charges of impeachment of the President. So those are the checks back and forth. And again, notice that Congress is where most of the power and most of the checks are in the hands of Congress, if they know it and if they use it. The doctrine of representation is next. Article 4, Section 4 says, "The United States shall guarantee to every state in this union a republican form of government." Webster's 1828 American Dictionary of the English Language defines a republic as a state in which the exercise of sovereign power is lodged in representatives elected by the people. In the Old Testament, we find examples of representation. Moses was encouraged by his father-in-law Jethro to choose representatives and judges to help him lead Israel. It says, "You be the people's representative before God, and select out of all the people able men who fear God, men of truth, those who hate dishonest gain, and place these as leaders of thousands, of hundreds, of fifties, and tens," to be representative. And notice there's a hint there at the different levels of government that we looked at a little bit earlier. Different levels, leaders of thousands, of hundreds, of fifties, and tens, as representatives of the people. The New Testament contains some examples of representation. In John 5, Acts 6, and 1 Timothy 3, the first century church is an example of representative government. Jesus himself said, "I have come in my Father's name." There's the ultimate representative. He is not only our representative, he's our Savior. The 12 disciples were told to select among you 7 men of good reputation, full of wisdom, whom we may put in charge of this task, to represent us. And St. Paul said, if any man aspires to the office of overseer, he must be above reproach, because he's going to represent the people. Noah Webster said, the brief exposition of the Constitution will unfold to young persons the principles of Republican government, and our citizens should early understand that the genuine source of correct Republican principles is what? The Bible, particularly the New Testament, or the Christian religion. This was in his History of the United States, published in 1832, used in our public schools for many, many, many years. It's gone now. Of course, representation at the federal level consists of Congress. And during the Constitutional Convention, this was a huge issue. The large states, of course, wanted representation in Congress to be proportional by population for obvious reasons. The small states wanted equal representation, as it had been under the Articles of Confederation, for obvious reasons. We're all equal in one sense. And our representation at the federal level, it should all be equal, like it has been under the Articles of Confederation. So the compromise that was reached is a two-house compromise. It was a win-win compromise. We have two houses. The House of Representatives is proportional by population. The large states win. The Senate is equal by states. The small states win. The House of Representatives are selected by the people. The Senate was to be selected by state legislatures, and of course that changed with the 17th Amendment. But that was the design of the founders, that the senators would be selected by state legislatures. The House of Representatives, being selected by the people, represent the people and are accountable to the people. The Senate, on the other hand, chosen by the states, represented the states and was accountable to the state legislators, and they could be recalled by the state legislators. That has happened. The House of Representatives is where the power lies. It's the most powerful branch because it holds the power of the purse. And yes, it could do away with Obamacare by simply refusing to fund it. They need to do that. The Senate, on the other hand, is a more stable body. They serve longer terms. They engage in foreign affairs, primarily. The House of Representatives serves short terms. Notice that where the power is, they have the shortest terms. They have to face the voters every 2 years. Notice the wisdom of that design. Most of the power is in the House. They have to face the voters more often. The Senate, on the other hand, is dealing with foreign affairs and things like that. Important, yes. They serve longer terms for stability, but they get to stay for 6 years, and they overlap. We all know how that works. Okay, so here's a good question. Must representatives do the will of the people? How many say yes? Okay. How many say no? Okay, good answers. The answer is yes and no. You knew that was coming, didn't you? Okay, here's the deal. We the people, in the preamble to the Constitution, certifies that the Constitution is the sovereign will of the people, and a rep's oath binds him to it. Yes, a rep must do the will of the people. What is the will of the people? The Constitution. It says so. We the people of the United States, in order to form a more perfect union, etc., etc. That is the will of the people. But, on the other hand, if popular voter sentiment asks a rep to do something not authorized by the Constitution, his oath to the Constitution forbids him do it. This distinguishes a republic from a democracy. We'll talk more about that in a minute. United States Supreme Court Justice and author of commentaries on the Constitution, the great work on the Constitution, Joseph Story. Republics are created by the virtue, public spirit, and intelligence of the citizens. They fall when the wise are banished from public councils because they dare to be honest, and the profligate are rewarded because they flatter the people in order to betray them. We see that in action today. So that's the doctrine of representation. Lastly, we look at the doctrine of reserved individual rights. God's good gifts to individuals include natural rights and the liberty to exercise them. James 1:17 says, "Every good thing bestowed and every perfect gift is from above, coming down from the Father of lights." John Adams said, "You have rights antecedent to all earthly governments, rights that cannot be repealed or restrained by human laws, rights derived from the great legislator, capital G, capital L, of the universe." Our Bill of Rights has a preamble. How many people knew that? We all know there's a preamble to the Constitution, but there's also a preamble to the Bill of Rights. It's usually not printed. Good pocket constitutions have the preamble to the Bill of Rights, and it contains these words: "To prevent misconstruction or abuse of its powers," the Constitution's powers, "that further declaratory and restrictive clauses should be added." That's what the Bill of Rights is. It's really a bill of government shalt nots. They all read in the negative. Congress shall make no law. The right of the people to keep and bear arms shall not be infringed, etc., etc. They're all written in the negative. They do not grant you rights, ladies and gentlemen. The Bill of Rights, the Constitution, none of that grants you a single right. They are all pre-existing rights that come from God, and the purpose of government is merely to protect those rights. And the Bill of Rights was written in the negative to protect our pre-existing God-given rights at the federal level, to make sure that the federal government did not abuse those rights, but exercised its duty before God to protect them. The Bill of Rights protects individuals' rights from abuse by that federal government. The Ninth Amendment, near the end of the Bill of Rights, says the enumeration in the Constitution of certain rights shall not be construed to deny or disparage others retained by the people. If they're retained by the people, where did the people get them? From God. The best defense of individual rights is a republic and not a democracy. We have to face this head on and understand that our founders created a republic for us, not a democracy. What's the difference? Well, here's one summary. In a democracy, it's a government of masses by majority. Majority rules. Thus, all of the emphasis on polls that the media keeps pumping into us day in and day out. 51% of the people now approve of whatever. Therefore, what's the implication? That ought to be the law. Majority rules. Government of masses, simply by majority. On a republic, on the other hand, it's a government indirect through representatives under law, which we shall see in a moment. Democracy is a rule by men. A republic is a rule of law. John Adams and others spoke of a republic. The Republic of the United States being a nation of laws and not of men. This is precisely what he's talking about. Laws, republic, not of men, democracy. A democracy is characterized by demagogism, agitation, and mobocracy. Mobocracy, that's an interesting word. It almost sounds like something that's a recent coining. Actually, Benjamin Rush, one of our founders, coined the word mobocracy, and it's a good description of what democracy really is. It's mob rule. That's what it really is. A republic, on the other hand, is characterized by statesmanship, liberty, and justice. These are characteristics of our founders. Democracy, individual minority rights are insecure. Why? Because 51% majority can simply vote away the rights and the property of the minority. A republic is the only form of government in which individual and minority rights are secure, because it is of law and not of men, not of mobs. This little summary, by the way, comes from something called the U.S. Army Training Manual, number 2000-25. It was published in 1928, and it was used in the training of those persons who were new recruits to the armed forces of the United States. They had several different training manuals. Well, this one was on citizenship. It was a rather lengthy document, and it contains this nice summary of what a republic and a democracy is. And they were taught properly that when they take the oath to the Constitution, for which they may be asked to lay down their lives, they better understand what they're fighting for. This is the republic that you were fighting for. You were fighting for a republic described in our Constitution. This is what you're going to take an oath to. They wanted them to understand what they were fighting for. Funny thing happened to this document. During FDR's administration, he ordered that all copies of this be gathered and destroyed. You can find it on the internet. It's real. It's there. I'm still looking for an original hard copy, and I'll pay good bucks for one if somebody can find one. There's got to be one out there someplace. Okay? So, republic or democracy? What did our early founders say about republics and democracies? Do you think maybe George Washington knew something about it? He was our first president. He won the war for us. He was the president of the Constitutional Convention that gave us our Constitution. I think he knew a little bit about it. He said republicanism is not the phantom of a deleted imagination. On the contrary, laws under no form of government are better supported, liberty and property better secured, or happiness more effectually dispensed to mankind. Republicanism. What about our second president, John Adams? He said, remember, democracy never lasts long. It soon wastes, exhausts, and murders itself. There never was a democracy yet that did not commit suicide. John Adams. These guys had studied history. They knew what they were talking about. What about our third president, Thomas Jefferson? He said the Republican is the only form of government which is not eternally at open or secret war with the rights of mankind. We talked about that a little while ago. Okay, we're on a roll here. How about our fourth president, James Madison? He said democracies have ever been spectacles of turbulence and contention, have ever been found incompatible with personal security or the rights of property, and have in general been as short in their lives as they have been violent in their deaths. James Madison, father of the Constitution, one of three authors of the Federalist Papers. He wrote this in the Federalist number 10. Another author of the Federalist, Alexander Hamilton. We are a republic. Real liberty is never found in despotism or in the extremes of democracy. There's your real extremists, democracy. The third author of the Federalist Papers, John Jay, pure democracy, like pure rum, easily produces intoxication, and with it 1,000 pranks and fooleries. I do not expect mankind will, before the millennium, be what they ought to be. And therefore, in my opinion, every political theory which does not regard them as being what they are will prove abortive. He was also the first Chief Justice of the Supreme Court. There was another famous political author, however, who wrote in the Communist Manifesto in 1848, the first step in the revolution is to raise the proletariat to the position of ruling class, to win the battle of democracy. Modern commentarians, H.L. Mencken, democracy is a pathetic belief in the collective wisdom of individual ignorance. I love this one by Winston Churchill. The best argument against democracy is a 5-minute conversation with the average voter. If you've had discussions about political matters, you know what he's talking about. So that's the doctrine of reserved individual rights and how they are protected under a republic, not a democracy. So, the U.S. Constitution is established a republic by the people's will. It is man's best law. It is not God's perfect law. But James 1:25 says, one who looks intently at the perfect law, the law of liberty, and abides by it, this man will be blessed in what he does. 2 Corinthians 3:17, where the Spirit of the Lord is, again, there is liberty. James Madison, every word of it decides a question between power and liberty. Liberty, folks, is what it's all about. That's what Freedom Forum is all about. So the doctrines of the Constitution. You can use the flag to help you remember these too. 7 of them, 7 red stripes. The doctrine of fidelity to Declaration principles, the doctrine of original intent, the doctrine of enumerated powers, the doctrine of separation of powers, the doctrine of balance of powers, the doctrine of representation, and the doctrine of reserved individual rights. Now, it looks to me like those powers need organized. That's better. Thank you very much. Questions?
There was I had a question here with regards to the business of the states coining money, and according to this, no, they can't, but they can utilize the gold and silver. At least that's how I'm phrasing it here. I understood, and a lot of people generally would say, states could coin money. Now, can you explain that?
Yes. The states are not authorized by the Constitution to coin money. In fact, they are forbidden to do so. But the Constitution actually tells the states that only gold and silver shall be accepted in payment of debt. Is that a contradiction? No. The federal government coined money, silver and gold. Also, there was bullion, silver and gold bullion, which persons in states could use for the payments of debt. So there's no contradiction there. States, it's just one of those powers that belongs to the federal government, does not belong to the states. But the states are told to only accept gold and silver money, or gold and silver bullion, for payment of debt. But they can't coin it. They can't coin money out of it. Only the federal government can do that. Anybody else? Yes, sir.
Talking of democracies, have there ever been democracies?
Oh, yes. Times, we learn of the Greek democracies. Those are the ones that are usually cited initially. Rome, on the other hand, was created as a republic with a senate representing the people and so forth. Now, very similar to our form of government. It eventually degenerated into what's the word I'm looking for? Under the Caesars, an oligarchy of a very small number of people ruling by edict, by fiat, in Rome. But it was established as a republic originally. Back to your question, though. Democracies. Greece was the first great democracy, the Greek states. Other more recent countries are attempting to function like democracies, but they really have a lot of characteristics of republic. I mean, I'm thinking of Israel, for instance. But what you call something and what it is are not necessarily the same thing. All the commentators and almost all of our politicians speak glowingly of our democracy. They speak glowingly of the democracy in Israel or the democracy someplace or whatever. In some cases, they are closer to democracies. In most cases, they're actually probably closer to republic. But the people participate in their government by a direct vote of representatives. That's a democratic element, but the actual laws are carried out, and the government is, the functionaries of the government are functioning under the law, not under majority rule. So they are really republics. And republics are the only stable form of government, as we were learned earlier. So, yeah, there have been some examples of democracies, but most of them have, as Adams noted and as Madison noted, democracies throughout history have been colossal failures. They just don't work. Alexander Tytler was a political science person, wrote textbooks and stuff that our founders learned from. And he had some democracies cannot exist as a permanent form of government. With the result that they always vote for candidates who promise them somebody else's money, a largest from the public treasury, with the results that democracies always collapse from loose fiscal policy and always result in dictatorships. This was common knowledge, but people of the people.
You mentioned the Congress compact. Is that the same thing that Hannity and what's his name, Rush Limbaugh promoted in the CON, or is that a separate?
There are at least 3 different groups or organizations or pushes that are taking place right now to move us to another constitutional convention by whatever name. One is called the Conference of the States, the other is called the Compact of States. That's the one I specifically referenced. And there's a couple more of them out there floating around, Power to the People or something. I forget. There's another name for another one. But they're all pushing for an Article 5 convention. It is a constitutional convention. They deny that because down through the years, many good conservative groups have successfully argued against a constitutional convention. So they say, no, this is something else. This is a Conference of the States. This isn't a constitutional convention. So they're avoiding the issue. It is a constitutional convention. And as a matter of fact, if it isn't, if it's something else, then challenge them. Where is the authorization for your plan in the Constitution? It's not there. There is the traditional method where an amendment passes both houses by 2/3, goes to the states for ratification, 3/4 of the states ratify, it becomes part of the Constitution. We've used that 27 times. Okay? We've never used Method B. Method B is 2/3 of the states call for a convention, Congress calls a convention, they meet, do whatever they want to do, by the way. And I mean whatever they want to do. Never mind what you're being told by these people. They can do anything they want to do. Why do I say that? We have one historical precedent. The Constitutional Convention of 1787 was convened, quote, for the sole and express purpose of revising the Articles of Confederation, unquote. That was what Congress authorized, a convention for revising the Articles of Confederation. What did they do? They gave us a brand new Constitution, which by the grace of God is the best Constitution known to man. But look who was there. Look what their worldview was. We don't have Washingtons and Jeffersons and Hamiltons and Madisons anymore. They're gone. We have a bunch of politicos. And by the way, there's a guy named George Soros who wants his hands on our Constitution so bad that he can taste it. And he is pushing for a con with every dollar that he's got. And he has given his credit card, basically it's a no-limit credit card, to these groups, whatever it takes to get a convention. I ask some of these people who call themselves conservatives, are you aware of who's financing this? Somebody put it like this. Somebody who wants to get into bed or go to church and sit in a pew with these people, consider who you're sitting with and whose money built the church. It's George Soros' money. That's who's behind the Constitutional Convention, and they hate the Constitution. Okay? So very, very, very risky business. I have another entire presentation called Miracles Happen Only Once on the dangers of a Constitutional Convention, why we can't let it happen. But I can't imagine that some of these otherwise conservative people have been duped into going for this. It baffles me. I don't know why they do it. Yes, sir.
So this is going to take place on July 4th, you said? Did I get that right?
There's a gathering supposed to happen in Dallas. They're calling themselves a compact of the states, and if they can get 38 state representatives there, representatives of 38 states, they're going to go through this process, and they're going to do this thing.
And they will overturn the Constitution, basically, and they'll change it, and they're probably up to no good.
They're definitely up to no good. The only question is if they do it, if they get the states to show up, if they do their thing, and even if they manage to restrict it to one amendment, which on its surface looks good enough, balanced budget amendment, okay. I could go on for hours about why that probably isn't going to work anyway. But if they succeed, with any luck at all, it'll be challenged and struck down in the courts. But do not rely on federal courts to do the right thing. Recent history proves otherwise. It's a scary process. It really is a scary, and you'd have to listen to the whole presentation to get the whole argument. Don't have time to get into it tonight. Yes, sir.
When you say representatives, are you talking senators or?
No, these are people,
Just
these are either governors who are themselves going, or designates of governors who think this is a good idea. They're going to send a delegate, and they are supposedly representatives. They haven't been picked by the people. The people have nothing to do with this. Okay, very important. Nothing to do with this. Okay, anybody else? Yes, sir.
The Constitution has been amended many times.
Yes.
Did any of these amendments were out of line with the intentions of
Oh,
the
yes.
founders?
Many. Many. The 16th, the 17th, the 23rd, which gives presidential electors to the District of Columbia. The District of Columbia was to be a special place, independent of any state, not a part of any state, not accountable to any state, a special set-aside place that's neutral. The 23rd Amendment gave the District of Columbia the same number of electors in a presidential election as the least populous state. That means 3. 1 for each senator. Every state gets 2, so the District of Columbia got 2, even though they're not a state. And they got 1 congressman, representative of the smallest state, which only gets 1 congressman. So the D.C. has 3 electors choosing who's going to be president. And who populates D.C.? The Washington bureaucrats who have a vested interest in bigger government. They have now 3 votes in choosing the president. Clearly not the intent of the founders. No way. There are others, but those come to my mind immediately. The 14th Amendment, the so-called incorporation doctrine, it's not in there, but the courts have put it in there the idea that the Bill of Rights is somehow incorporated into the 14th Amendment, and because of the language that says equal protection of the laws and all of that, that now the U.S. Federal Bill of Rights is incorporated into the 14th Amendment, and the federal courts enforcing the Bill of Rights on the states is a legitimate thing to do. That's the incorporation doctrine. That was not the intent of the founders. All states have their own constitutions. They all have bills of rights. You don't need the federal constitution enforced on the states. Obviously, never the intent. But the incorporation doctrine that the courts nourished and concocted out of the 14th Amendment is another concept that's totally contrary to the original intent. So there's some. Anybody else? Yes?
We were talking earlier about the business of control of whether states could not interfere with the actions of the federal government when it came to certain powers, like the war efforts and things like that. Now, we have an issue going on right now with regards to illegal aliens, and especially now with the children that are being brought over here, and we're finding out that there's a lot of medical conditions going on in this particular thing. Now, under these circumstances, do the states have a right to interfere, if I'm going to use that term, I don't know if it's the right one I need, but to stop this and keep them from having these people brought to their state illegally to begin with, and what actions can the states take in order to turn this around?
Well, that's kind of a messy issue. It involves several different concepts, but let me begin to attempt to explain it by going to Article 6, which is the Supremacy Clause, which says that this Constitution and all federal laws made under the Constitution, which allegedly all federal laws are supposed to be made under the authority of the Constitution, are the supreme law of the land, and judges in all the states are required to enforce them. Some people think that it simply says federal law trumps state law, period, over and out, done.
Which it doesn't.
No, it says the Constitution and all laws made pursuant to or under the authority of the Constitution are the supreme law of the land, okay? Well, it turns out that Congress has passed immigration laws. They're pretty fair, actually. But the President is violating Article 2 requirement to see that all laws be faithfully executed. There are federal laws, which they are simply not executing. So what are the states to do? Some people say the Supremacy Clause in the Sixth Amendment says, well, it's the Fed's business. The states have to stay out of it. No, if the law was made constitutionally and properly, which most immigration laws were, and if the federal government is not doing its duty because the President is not seeing to it that the laws are faithfully executed, then the people, through interposition on behalf of their state leaders and the process of nullification if necessary, but interposition is the doctrine that's most applicable here, have a right to interpose and take action, like the people down in Marietta did. They formed a wall and said, the buses aren't coming through, we're not going to take those guys here. The buses turned around, went someplace else. That was an attempt of we the people to actually stand in there, or some of our legal appointed representatives, or I don't know if some sheriffs were involved. I don't know enough of the details about that to know exactly who was there blocking those buses. But the point of it is, states have sovereignty, and the states existed and were sovereign before the federal government ever got created. So which has supremacy? That which is created and exists first always has supremacy. The creature is not greater than the creator. So the states absolutely have, as part of their sovereign powers, to protect their sovereignty and their state interests. They absolutely do, particularly when they have federal law on their side, which the federal government is choosing not to enforce. So the federal government is breaking the Constitution, particularly Article 2 that says the President has to enforce the laws that are properly made constitutional laws. They're not. So the people are stepping in and protecting their state. As a sovereign state, they have a right to do that. Anybody else?
I was wondering what fidelity means.
Fidelity means be true to. If you have fidelity to your mate, you are true to your mate, to your spouse. Fidelity to laws would mean strict adherence to laws.
All right.
fidelity to the to the Declaration would be strict adherence to those great principles in the Declaration, like natural law and equality, and
Sorry, I went to public school.
that's okay. It's quite all right. Not a problem. Okay. Well, thank you very much. God bless you all.
I'll close the meeting, everybody.
Is it possible to get a copy of the original writing of the
I need to finish up here. Let me,
Bob wants to close out the meeting, hold on.
pardon?
Go ahead, grab the mic, Bob, yeah.
I want to thank you all for being here, and I want to thank Steve for the wonderful program that we had tonight. I would like to, I am going to do something I normally don't do with programs here, but for me, I believe that the people that didn't show up here tonight missed a tremendous amount of information. And so I'm going to ask Dennis to provide me a copy to send to my site. So I'm going to present this program on, put that on my site so that we can let other people see and hear these pieces of information along with the questions that have been asked tonight. Like I say, it's a rarity. I don't usually do this, but I feel this is critical. And Steve, I know I haven't talked to you yet, but you have a second half of this, and I would like to get an opportunity to reschedule with you further for part 2 of this presentation, because to me this is marvelous. So what, you agree with me? Okay, One thing I failed to do this earlier, and I want to do it now so that we finish, is that we didn't do the Pledge of Allegiance, and I'd like everybody to rise. And again, I remind you that there is no comma between one nation under God. Ready? Begin. I pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all. Thank you. Thank you again, and we are concluded.